40 years ago today, on January 23rd, 1984, Hulk Hogan defeated the Iron Sheik in Madison Square Garden to win his very first WWF Championship, ushering in the era of Hulkamania and changing the professional wrestling business forever. What's going on, guys? Good mic work back at you. Welcome to an exclusive mic drop. These comments are not pulled from a previous podcast or anything like that. This is a separate, standalone recording to acknowledge the 40th anniversary of what is arguably considered the birth of Hulkamania, even though Hulkamania got rolling a little bit in the AWA prior to his WWF title victory. Many people look at this date on the calendar as the day that Hulkamania was born. And 40 years is pretty mind-blowing to me because I'm 46 years old and I remember when Hogan won the title and a lot of those early days. And when you see how pivotal Hulk Hogan's career was to the evolution of the business that, has evolved to what we see today, Hogan was right in the dead center of two big boom periods in pro wrestling in the 80s and 90s, one as a babyface, one as a heel, and there really hasn't been a career quite like his ever in the history of wrestling. So I thought it would be appropriate to at least come up here today and acknowledge the 40th anniversary of Hulkamania and talk a little bit about his career, what it meant to me personally as a fan when I was growing up as a kid, and how I grew to watch Hogan as a teenager, as a young adult, and now, as a grown man where I am now, and just look at the overall body of work of Hulk Hogan in, a relatively short video here. And that's what we're here to do today. Now, full disclosure, most of you who have been watching this channel for a long time already know this. You know that I personally do not have any respect for Hulk Hogan. I lost a lot of respect for him after his in-ring days were over. The reality show that really seemed to destroy and blow up his family with his kids and the drama and the divorce, not to mention Hulk Hogan's sex tape controversy, his racist rant controversy that booted him out of the WWE Hall of Fame, his history of being a pathological liar. I mean, Hogan has told some whoppers in his day, and he tends to rewrite his own history and just makes up interactions that never even took place. He has a history of greed and political nonsense backstage and creative control. And like I said, with that reality show and the sex tape scandal, the racist comment, audio leak that really blew his world up, plus the weak-ass apology he gave when he came back, and a lot of just insincerity from Hogan, and it's just really hard to trust or believe anything the guy says. He seems to be doing pretty okay now. He's remarried. He was recently a hero, helping pull a teenager, I believe, out of an overturned car during a traffic accident. So Hogan seems to be, at least for right now, in a good place. But a lot of what Hogan has done outside of the wrestling ring has really personally bothered me as a fan, because I grew up watching Hogan and he was a hero of mine. For my 10th birthday, my parents got me a Hulk Hogan birthday cake. I had his action figures. I was a big Hogan fan from about ages 5 to about 10. And when you look at how important his career was, I have said this for years here on the podcast and in various situations where I think the biggest issue I always had with Hulk Hogan personally is that I really wanted him to be WWE's Babe Ruth. And I feel like Hogan, someone who had a career as successful as his, how he was a pro wrestler that really became a household name. Cover of Sports Illustrated, hosted Saturday Night Live. Everybody around the world, even if they didn't watch wrestling, probably has heard the name Hulk Hogan before. And I think WWE even intended on making him that Babe Ruth level of star in the company when they brought him back in, put him in the Hall of Fame. And I think that was WWE's intent, and it would have been really awesome if that was the case. But unfortunately, it feels like Hogan de-aged himself by about 30 years, starting in around 2005 when he started that reality show, and he started living a really, really wild life. And I was always very critical of that. I was always of the belief that Hogan, who has been so successful, made so much money, and traveled the world and made himself the biggest wrestling star in the history of wrestling, should be able to enjoy the fruits of his labor. All that money that he made, all that success he had, now that he's retired with a couple of artificial hips and he's in, physically in his decline, even though he's still hanging and banging and waddling around and working out. I always thought that it would have been great if Hogan just quietly kind of retired, sat back, enjoyed all of the money that he made, raise his family, be married, come in and out of WWE from time to time for appearances or Hall of Fame inductions or random just nostalgia moments that you could bring Hogan back in for. And it was just one controversy after another with this guy, with the lawsuits and everything else. And it was just really a big turn off. And I think the icing on the cake was just back in 2015 when that audio was released of him going on that racist rant, which in that rant, he himself calls himself a racist. So I don't know why we're even debating whether or not he is one. You know what I mean? He said it out of his own fucking mouth. So I just want to have that out there because I don't want this video to come across like I'm celebrating Hulk Hogan's career, even though we are a little bit. I do want to acknowledge all of the nasty shit that's attached to this guy's name and how, as a fan, I personally lost all respect for Hulk Hogan. But my lack of respect for the guy doesn't erase what he did in his pro wrestling career. And I think that's what I wanted to talk about primarily today, because I have a lot of memories of these early days when I was just a little piece of shit watching pro wrestling and watching Hulk Hogan get on the map. Now, his early life, of course, he played some bass guitar in several Florida-based rock bands, and he started a band, or he was a member of a band called Ruckus that played around the Florida bars in the Florida area there. He did go to college, went to community college, and spent some time at the University of South Florida. And it was, the story goes that it was Jack and Jerry Briscoe who stumbled across Hogan because a lot of the wrestlers in the Florida area would frequent a lot of the bars that Ruckus played at. So I think Jack and Jerry kind of discovered Hogan, saw his size, saw his presence, and convinced him to give wrestling a try. And then they went to Hiro Matsuda and convinced Matsuda to train Hulk Hogan. And of course, the famous story goes, after just a little bit of training, Matsuda breaks Hulk Hogan's leg, takes him about, close to a year to recover, and he comes back kind of earning that respect. And he finished up his training and he began wrestling about a month before I was born. In August of 1977 was when Hogan had his first match. He also helped get his buddy, Brutus Beefcake, into the biz. Ed Leslie, who was a longtime friend of Hogan's, he got into the biz with Hogan, and the two started wrestling together once Brutus was trained as the Boulder Brothers in Alabama. They wrestled in Memphis for Jerry Jarrett. And I remember as a kid growing up, around like 1986, 1987, when Beefcake was in the Dream Team, the conversation and the chatter around school and the lunch table was that Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake were brothers. And a lot of that stemmed from them teaming as brothers, as kayfabe brothers, back in the Indies. But I always remembered that rumor as a kid that Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake were brothers, and it's pretty much from where they got their start. Now, the story goes that Terry Funk is the one that introduced Hulk Hogan to Vince McMahon Sr., and he wound up debuting for WWF in 1979. So Hogan was in the WWE from 1979 to 1981 as a heel, working with Classy Freddie Blassie as his manager, and he worked some pretty big matches in those early days. He worked against Backlund, challenged him for the title, and also had a lot of matches with Andre the Giant, culminating in that big Shea Stadium match in New York in front of God knows how many people, where Hulk Hogan body slammed Andre the Giant. Hogan body slammed Andre a few times in that early feud, but Andre always got the better of Hulk and put him down. And then was the Rocky III movie. He got the part in Rocky III. Vince McMahon Sr. did not want him to do the movie, and there was a dispute there. So Hulk Hogan left the WWF thinking he would never be back there again, because Vince said, if you go do that movie, you're never going to work here again. So Hogan said, F you, went to go do the Rocky movie. And when he was done, he signed with AWA and Vern Gagne. So Vern brought him in, and he started basically doing the same thing that he was doing in the WWE as a heel. He was a heel wrestler, but instead of Freddie Blassie, he had Luscious Johnny. Luscious Johnny Valiant was his manager right there at the beginning, but that didn't last very long because Hogan started to get over, hugely over, and became a babyface and started challenging Nick Bockwinkel all over the country. And there was a lot of matches between Hogan and Bockwinkel that spanned at least a year, because back in those days, you could really stretch things out. And Vern Gagne was of a different a different mindset to where he believed it was all about the chase, because every time, you know, a guy's chasing the title, you can count on a sold out house. And I think he just went to that well one too many times. There was the famous match where Hogan actually beat Nick Bockwinkel and was announced as the new AWA champion, and the crowd was going nuts. But Stanley Blackburn overturned the ruling because there was a foreign object used, and the belt was given back to Nick Bockwinkel. And I think that was really kind of part of the turning point there in AEW, when there was a lot of money to be made there on the table for Verne Gagne if he would have strapped up Hogan and hitched the company to him. But for whatever reason, the timing wasn't right, and Verne, I think, really didn't have the same vision that Vince Jr. would have when he looked at Hulk Hogan. And then, of course, Vince Sr. sells his company to Vince Jr., and that's when Vince McMahon decides to go national, and he starts coming through trying to buy up all the territories, signing all of the big talents. And one of those names was Hulk Hogan, and he convinced Hulk Hogan to come back to the WWE in about late 1983. And Hogan had already booked out matches against Nick Bockwinkel around the territory, and he no-showed those to go back to WWE. And a whole bunch of people followed him from AWA, including Mean Gene Okerlund was one of the first ones. I think Hogan and Gene basically came in together. So Hogan was brought in super late, 1983, like the final week or two of 1983. And he came out on television to made his return to save Bob Backlund from a beatdown from the Wild Samoans. And I remember watching this, like flashbulb memories as a kid, seeing this when Hogan came back to the WWE, saved Bob Backlund. They did an interview with the two of them after Hogan returned, where Backlund said, you know, really quickly explained away why Hogan's no longer a heel anymore. And Bob Backlund said he's a changed man. He's not going to have Blassie with him, and basically endorsed Hulk Hogan. And this was right after Backlund had lost the WWE title to the Iron Sheik just a few days before this. So after that long run of Backlund, he is now beltless. Sheik is champion. Hogan comes in. Backlund endorses him quickly because Hogan is booked in a championship match against the Iron Sheik. And that is the day that we are here to acknowledge and celebrate today, January 23rd, 1984, Hulk Hogan versus new WWE champion Iron Sheik. Vince McMahon using Sheik as a transitional champion to get the belt from Backlund to Hogan. And Hogan was going to be a big part of Vince and WWE's national expansion. And Hogan is the American hero, and they do the match, and it's a pretty famous match. As a kid, I used to go back and watch this match over and over because it would be available on some videotapes. And Hogan was put in the camel clutch. He was the first person to power out of the camel clutch and was able to fight back on the Iron Sheik. And there was that famous finish where he drops the leg and he hooks Sheik's legs, and he's going like that as the referee's counting three. That was in the intro to so many WWE Coliseum videos, so many WWE TV shows back in the day. It is an image that is burned and tattooed into my young wrestling mind. That image of just Hogan winning the title, holding up that big green belt, which I think at the time they were putting all the winners on it, kind of like the Stanley Cup. And Hogan holding up that title after having Backlund as champion for about 5 years. Then you have Sheik as champion for 1 month, and he drops it to Hulk Hogan that quickly. And that was really the day that WWE changed. It was a different product. It was a different animal. It was a different direction from that moment on. And in the backstage area, Hulk Hogan celebrating with Mean Gene Okerlund and his mom and dad, who were there as well. Andre the Giant comes in with champagne and celebrates and also endorses Hulk Hogan. So as soon as Hogan came back, he got 2 huge endorsements from Bob Backlund and Andre the Giant. And that was a big deal. And that's really important in my wrestling memories as a kid because it was one of the first dates that ever stuck out in my head. I always remembered January 23rd, 1984, probably one of the earliest examples of me being a smark or a mark or a little piece of shit fan or fansplaining things to people would have been WrestleMania 6 in 1990. I remember we watched that at my house, and my mom invited her friend who had 2 daughters. Both of them were close to my age. We went to school together, and they kind of watched wrestling. They weren't a Psycho fan like me, but they both watched wrestling and were interested in what was going to happen, so we invited them over. And I remember during the Hogan and Warrior match, I was like, it's been 6 years now, January 23rd, 1984, when Hogan won that belt, and he's pretty much been on top. And I remember trying to explain to everybody in the room, how dominant Hulk Hogan had been up until that point. But ever since I was a kid, I think before age 10, I had that date in my head, and I've always remembered it, January 23rd, 1984. If you go back and look at my social media, every year, on that day, I probably am saying something about Hulk Hogan, or at least acknowledging that day. So it's a day that, holds a big part of my wrestling memory, and it's a day that I consider very, very important and very, very significant in pro wrestling. Once Hogan became the champion, then they were off and running with him, but it still took him a little while to become the red and yellow American hero that we would see, because in the first couple of years there in 1984 and 1985, Hogan was still using Eye of the Tiger. He hadn't even used Real American yet, so he was coming out to Eye of the Tiger, which is kind of a link to the Rocky movies. And they had also changed up the WWF Championship belt like 3 or 4 times in 1984 and 1985. Hogan had a couple of different versions of that belt before he would wear what many people call the 86 belt. But in those early days of 84 and 85, the title, the physical belt itself was changing a lot. And I remember some of those early days of Hulkamania. I remember some rematches with the Iron Sheik. There's one match that exists on one of Hulk Hogan's videotapes. By the way, I have all of those like Hulkamania VHSs. I have everything from back in those days. And there's a rematch between him and the Iron Sheik on one of those tapes, and that one was much more competitive than their MSG match. Sheik took his boot off and bloodied up Hulk Hogan, and it felt like more of a rematch. And back in those days, Hogan was still a little bit grittier, still bleeding a lot. He was still doing a lot of stints in Japan, wearing a lot of different colored gear. He would wear black, he would wear blue, he would wear white, he would wear red. He wore a lot of different colors before finally kind of settling on the yellow trunks and the red knee pads and whatnot. So those early days of Hulkamania in 84 and 85, I remember his rematches with the Iron Sheik. I remember his friendship with Hillbilly Jim. That was a big one. As a matter of fact, my Hulk Hogan LJN rubber figure from back in the day, I got in a Hillbilly Jim and Hulk Hogan tag team set. And so he had the friendship with Hillbilly Jim, discovered him, gifted him his pair of boots that he wore his whole career. I remember him working with, of course, Roddy Piper, the big feud with Roddy Piper that set up the war to settle the score, the partnering with MTV, the rock and wrestling connection, Cyndi Lauper, Mr. T, WrestleMania 1, that whole deal there, that first year or so of Hulkamania was so important leading up to WrestleMania 1 for all of the mainstream press and publicity they were getting, and they were expanding and expanding hard. And it was like the inflation. It was like the beginning of the universe. It's like, boom, it exploded so big, so quickly in a short amount of time. And it was wild. In 1986, I remember, the WrestleMania 2 match, working with Bundy in the steel cage, and he worked with Bundy and Studd, Big John Studd, a lot. He tag teamed with Andre. A lot of times it was Andre and Hogan facing Bundy and Studd. Again, some of my most fond early grade school childhood memories were of Hogan and Andre teaming up to face Bundy and Studd. And even back then, chatters around the playground and stuff, we all did wonder if Hogan and Andre might actually face each other again one day. It just didn't feel possible because Andre was a babyface. They also had the cartoon, that rock and wrestling cartoon that Hogan was a part of. And probably one of my favorite feuds, or maybe even my favorite feud that Hogan ever had, was in 1986 with Paul Orndorff. And not only was that a gritty feud between, two Florida boys that felt a little bit real. It felt like the animosity might actually really exist there between those two. And I think another reason why that feud sticks out in my mind so much is because I was sitting on my living room floor, crisscross applesauce, watching Paul Orndorff clothesline Hulk Hogan and turn on him in that tag team match with Bundy and Studd. They were setting it up behind the scenes. Backstage, you could smell something was going to happen. And then boom, Orndorff nails Hogan, hits him with a pile driver. And when you're 9 years old, seeing somebody get hit with a pile drivers were not something that you saw every day. I was 9 years old. I'd probably only seen about 12 pile drivers by that point. So it's not like they happened all the time. And for Orndorff to hit Hogan with that was crazy. And then they traveled the country feuding all over the world in the house shows, and they had that big match at the big event, that stadium show in Toronto that had like 60,000 fans there to see Hulk Hogan take on Paul Orndorff. They worked cage matches together. It was a great feud, and again, another one that really, really sticks out in my mind. And, you know, Hogan also, like I said, he would travel back and forth to Japan. He's been doing that since he started, and he always had a really good relationship with the Japanese promotions and the wrestlers there. And anytime Hogan was there, this is all throughout his career. Go back and watch like 1983 through 1993, Hulk Hogan Japan matches. He wrestles a unique style there. He has unique matches and works a different style than you would see from Hulk. That's because he knows what territory he's in and what those fans expect. And a lot of those matches are honestly really fun to watch. I've always said that about Hogan. I've brought it up several times throughout the years that when Hogan really wanted to turn it on, he could surprise you with, you know, once he got cooking, you know, how good he could really be in there. And the guy, you know, really does have decent wrestling psychology when you put him in the right environment. Hogan knows what he's doing. He actually does. Sometimes it looks like he can't wrestle his way out of a paper bag, but when you really get down to it, Hogan's smart and he knows what to do. Now, Hogan's career then took him into what still to this day I believe is the biggest professional wrestling match that has ever took place. Massive personal memory for me. WrestleMania 3, 93,000 people in the city that I was born in. I was born in Pontiac General Hospital, right down the road from the Silver Dome, and Hogan and Andre coming together before social media, before, you know, a lot of heavy advertising, when you had to actually go and drive to a ticket outlet to purchase your ticket, and the fact that they were still able to put close to 100,000 people in the Silver Dome to watch Hulk Hogan and Andre's epic clash was a huge moment in wrestling, and it's still an iconic moment right here as you see Hogan and Andre. That shot of them in the ring at WrestleMania 3, I think still is, you know, a Rushmore type of image in terms of the most important, just single still shot, snapshot images that you can have throughout the history of wrestling. That Hogan and Andre stare down has to be right at the top, you would think. So Hogan was on a roll all the way from 84 all the way through 87, slamming and defeating Andre the Giant. And I consider that kind of like Act 1 in Hulk Hogan's career. Hogan winning the title from the Iron Sheik in 1984, all the way up until when Hulk Hogan lost the WWE title to Andre the Giant on NBC primetime main event. Something like 30 million people watched this match happen. And I had just moved to North Carolina. I had relocated from Michigan as a 10-year-old kid down to North Carolina. We had only been living there for a few months when this match took place, and I watched it in the living room with my family, and my parents, you know, who knew what a big Hogan fan I was, were a little bit worried about me. I remember even my mom coming upstairs to my room, checking on me before I went to bed, making sure I was okay, because I was like playing with my Hogan figurines or whatever. And it was crazy. That was the double referee deal with Earl and Dave, and then Andre won the title, and then he immediately gifted it to Ted DiBiase, and then they forfeited the title, had a tournament for it at WrestleMania 4, which Randy Savage won. And that took us into basically Hulk Hogan's second act. And he would spend the majority of 1988 not as WWE champion, riding alongside Randy Savage as a member of the Mega Powers. And all year long, even at the end of WrestleMania 4, as a fan, you knew what WrestleMania 5's main event was going to be. They were going to tell that story all year. Hulk Hogan did the No Holds Barred movie during that time. He would also come back to do other movies in the next couple of years, like Mr. Nanny and Suburban Commando. And then I think in his WCW days, he did Santa with Muscles. So Hogan has always dabbled in the B straight-to-video movie universe a couple of times. And that Mega Power storyline was another really important one to me as a kid. And of course, that would all culminate. A lot of these WrestleMania main events were set up on these NBC shows in February every year. This year would be no different in 1989 when Hogan and Savage set up their face-off at WrestleMania, when Savage finally turned heel on him on that NBC show, attacking him in the doctor's area when Elizabeth was being attended to, setting up your WrestleMania 5 main event with Hogan getting the belt back and winning it for the second time at WrestleMania 5. He remained dominant all through 1989, feuding with Zeus a little bit, and then we go into 1990. And just 2 days ago, right here on the channel, we did a watch-along of the Royal Rumble 1990, where Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior faced off for the first time. That made 12-year-old Greg crap his pants, and that was going to be your real big WrestleMania 6 main event that was also kind of set up on that February NBC main event. It was perfect and genius against Hogan and Warrior. Miscommunication, Warrior decks Hogan by accident or vice versa, and then there's a big face-off, and that's when they make the match for WrestleMania 6. And Hogan loses, does the honors to the Ultimate Warrior in the main event of WrestleMania 6 in Skydome. 60-something thousand people there to watch that match. I feel like WWE intended that to be a passing of the torch type of situation, but Hogan, even though he did it, he didn't seem to be that thrilled with it. And by the time we got to 1991, Vince had made the decision to go back to Hulk Hogan. And looking back, like we talked about the other night on the watch along, I don't think having Warrior beat Hogan at WrestleMania 6 was the wrong call at all. That turned out to be one of the coolest and most unique WrestleMania matches in history, because I watched that live and I was shocked as hell that Hogan got pinned clean. Nobody had ever seen that before. I think maybe some of the execution with the Warrior after the fact might have contributed to Vince's decision to go back to Hogan, or it might have just been Hogan politicking for it. One way or the other, he got the belt back at WrestleMania 7, defeating Sergeant Slaughter before dropping it later that year in Detroit to The Undertaker. And then we would be into 1992, and that's when Hulk Hogan kind of had his first retirement. That was when they first started bringing it up. They decided to put the title on Ric Flair in the Royal Rumble. They were going to do Hogan and Flair at WrestleMania. Plans changed. Flair worked with Savage. Hogan would then work the main event against Sid in a match that he was billing as probably his last match, at least for a little while. Big sit-down interview with Vince McMahon ahead of WrestleMania 8, where Vince thanked Hulk Hogan for his years of service and wished him the best. And Hogan, of course, did win that night via disqualification. Ultimate Warrior came back at WrestleMania 8, and then that was pretty much it. Hogan was gone again for another year, and then he returned in 1993. Now, around this time, the steroid scandal had kind of started. Vince was dealing with that. Hogan came back in at the very beginning of 1993, right when Monday Night Raw started 31 years ago, and set up the big tag match at WrestleMania 9. And then, of course, he would crash the main event after Yoko cheated to beat Bret Hart at WrestleMania 9. Hogan came out, Fuji challenges him, Hogan gets in the ring, beats Yoko in 5 seconds, and wins the WWE title again at WrestleMania 9 in 1993. And by that point, I was way over Hulk Hogan. I was 3 years over Hulk Hogan, and Bret was my guy. And I was very, very disappointed at the ending of that WrestleMania. And I still am. When I look back at that now and think about how ridiculous that was, that they did that, is pretty mind-blowing. But it was another big moment in Hogan's career, and that made him a 5-time WWE champion. He would, of course, then lose the title to Yokozuna just a couple of months later at King of the Ring, when there might have been some politics at play there as well. A lot of talk about a match with Bret at SummerSlam that Hogan didn't want to do, and decided just to drop the title to Yoko instead and leave the WWE for 9 years. He would be gone after that loss. During this time, Vince has got the steroid trial still happening. He has neck surgery. And right before WCW signs Hulk Hogan, he has to testify in the steroid trial against Vince McMahon. And actually, his testimony is what helps Vince McMahon get acquitted. And then just days after that whole steroid trial comes to an end, Hulk Hogan signs with WCW, which was huge because WCW was always, kind of like the minor leagues, production-wise, talent-wise, everything just felt second rate to the professional level that WWE was always producing. And Hogan coming in was really going to change the guard in WCW. They had the ticker tape parade for him. They had Mean Gene, who was already in the company by that point. So was Bobby Heenan. History was starting to repeat itself here with everybody leaving the AWA and coming to WWE. Now everybody's leaving WWE and going to WCW. Gene was there. Bobby was there. Hulk Hogan comes in, and a lot of big names followed behind him. Macho Man Randy Savage was there just a few months after Hogan got there. Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Big Boss Man, Earthquake. A lot of those stars from the WWE 80s and early 90s were starting to turn up in WCW because Hogan was there, and that was going to usher in a new era for them. And Hogan's initial run there was huge for the company. Hogan joining WCW was huge for them, but he was kind of tainted by that point because the steroid trial, he had to admit that he used steroids after being adamant that he had never used steroids before. And of course, he's a role model to kids. Say your prayers, take your vitamins, not those vitamins, and believe in yourself and all that shit. So it made him look really bad, kind of tainted his reputation a little bit. But still, the Hulk Hogan name was going to do wonders for WCW, and it did. His feuds with Ric Flair right there in the beginning, winning the title, because of course they threw the title right at Hogan the minute he walked in the door. His feud with the Giant, his feud with the Dungeon of Doom. A lot of that stuff was really hokey in his early days of WCW as a babyface. But then in 1996, Hulk Hogan changed the business for the second time when he joined the NWO. And that is still, to this day, has got to go down as one of the biggest moments in wrestling history because that was the second wave. You know, Hogan had the big boom period in the 90s there, and then the formation of the NWO really changed the business a second time. And then just a short time after that, you've got Stone Cold Steve Austin getting on the map on the other show and ushering in the Attitude Era, and wrestling was about to see the most success it has ever seen. And honestly, Hulk Hogan was a huge part of that, turning heel. And one thing I've always praised Hulk Hogan for and been so amazed by as a fan is the fact that in my mind, he was able to reach equal level of stardom as a heel and a face in two different companies, in two different eras. You know, Hogan as a heel, as the leader of the NWO, winning the title, he was great in that role. He was such an asshole, you know, in the promos that he cut and being the centerpiece of all of that. He was a really hated villain. And Hulk Hogan did a great job of that. He was one of the most, perhaps even the most beloved babyface of all time, and perhaps the most hated villain of all time. He can stake a claim to both of those, and not too many guys can say they did that. But joining up with Hall and Nash, how crazy that whole situation was, them coming in from WWE and appearing to be outsiders, and then the biggest WWE star of all time joining them to take down WCW was a history-making storyline and one of the biggest wrestling has ever seen. As the leader of the NWO, we saw him feud with Lex Luger, Roddy Piper, the big Sting match, and also him putting over Goldberg in the Georgia Dome. That was WCW's WrestleMania 6, was Hogan putting over Goldberg. He wins the title, big stadium show, amazing moment. Hogan goes down, Bobby Heenan losing his mind on commentary. It was such a memory and one of the best moments in wrestling history, I think. I'm not a fan of Goldberg or Hogan. Neither one of those guys I like, but I can acknowledge how big that moment was that night in the Georgia Dome on Nitro. That was a big deal. Near the end of WCW, wheels started coming off there. WWE was kicking ass. Attitude Era was leaving these fools in the dust. So near the end of WCW, Hogan went back to his red and yellow. And then later on, they had that debacle at Bash at the Beach 2000. And then Hogan would be largely gone from the company until WWE would buy WCW in March of 2001. And that was the end of the Monday Night Wars. Now, Hulk Hogan would sit out his contract for another year, and he would actually make his return to the company in 2002 in one of the most surreal moments as a fan for me. The fact that Hulk Hogan was coming back into the company after all that time was really hard for me to wrap my head around. And when they brought Hogan back in, as a heel, as a member of the NWO, they brought Hogan, Hall, and Nash in together. But almost immediately when Hogan got there, it was like, boom, the nostalgia kicked in for the fans. He had the big, epic WrestleMania match with The Rock, another epic loss in the Sky Dome. And that night, Toronto just really embraced Hulk Hogan, and The Rock actually was the heel in that match, and the crowd is what helped make that match so special. And then after WrestleMania, I think WWE and Vince McMahon had no choice but to put the red and yellow back on Hulk Hogan and make him a babyface again. He had that long, emotional welcome and ovation by the audience on SmackDown right after that as well that brought him to tears. And then they put him in the ring with the newly crowned WWE champion who won the title in the main event of WrestleMania 19. The very next pay-per-view at Backlash, they put him in the ring with Hogan, and Hogan takes the fucking belt from him. You have to be kidding me. You have to be kidding me. I could not believe that back in the day as a fan, but looking back now in retrospect, I don't have a whole lot of problem with it, because one thing I will say about Hulk Hogan in 2002, not many other years are like this, but in 2002, Hulk Hogan did business. Yes, he won the WWE title, but that had nothing to do with Hulk Hogan's politics. He just got there. He wasn't going to be walking in the door demanding anything. This is what Vince McMahon wanted to do. Vince McMahon recognized the response he was getting from the audience and wanted to put the belt back on Hulk Hogan. And it was just a short time. It was one pay-per-view. He wanted a Backlash, dropped it at the next show to The Undertaker. He also jobbed to Triple H on TV since he beat him for the title. He got beat by Kurt Angle, tapped out by Kurt Angle, I think. Brock Lesnar beat the shit out of him in Richmond and spread Hogan's own blood on his chest. So he did a lot of jobs in 2002, even though he did win that championship. Of course, the big epic match at WrestleMania 19. So that's two WrestleMania matches in a row that he had that are very memorable with The Rock and Vince McMahon, that bloody affair at WrestleMania 19. I always thought it was a big disappointment that Hulk Hogan was kind of on the outs with the company during WrestleMania 20. That would have been great to have him there at WrestleMania 20 in Madison Square Garden. But after the Mr. America thing, I guess the relationship with him and Vince, kind of deteriorated. Hogan left the company, but then was brought back in 2005 to be a part of WrestleMania 21 and go into the WWE Hall of Fame. And that's when he made his return and did the deal with Muhammad Hassan, then teamed with Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels turned heel, setting up an epic SummerSlam match at 2005 between Shawn and Hulk Hogan, in a match that really disgusts me as a fan. Still to this day, nearly 20 years later, I do not believe Hulk Hogan should have gone over in that match. I think Shawn should have beat him, and it would have been a great feud had it gone as planned. I think this was supposed to be a series of matches, and then Hogan pulled his political card and decided he didn't want to do things that way. He would rather do it heel and babyface and go over. And for some reason, Vince McMahon is okay with this. For some reason, Vince McMahon allows Hogan to have these clauses in his contract that allows him to do this. So part of you wants to blame Hulk Hogan, but part of you also wants to blame Vince McMahon. Why are you letting him do this? You don't need it. It's not bringing anything to your company at this point. You guys are doing great business. It's nice to have Hogan around, and if Hogan wants to beat Shawn, fine, but I think there needs to be a feud or a series of matches there, and the fact that that wasn't able to happen is really still a hard pill for me to swallow as a fan. And as if that wasn't hard enough to swallow, the following year he comes back and does the same goddamn thing to Randy Orton. Not a fan of really anything Hulk Hogan did during that time. It was cool to see him back in a WWE ring in 2002, but for the most part, I was not enjoying anything he was doing on television and felt like he didn't really need to be there. Ever since then, he's made sporadic appearances on and off, coming in to do Raw homecoming shows or do appearances or tribute Mean Gene when he passed away, or dress up in a fucking pirate suit and host WrestleMania with his black shield, Titus O'Neil. WWE brought him back, reinstated him into the Hall of Fame. He offered an apology to the WWE locker room after his racist comments were leaked, but many in the locker room did not accept his apology, felt that it was very insincere and very weak, and a lot of people felt like he was more sorry that he got caught than he was sorry for doing it. And I think that is usually the case with a lot of people who get busted. And I think it was just a lot of insincerity coming from Hulk Hogan, especially since he already has the reputation of being a pathological liar. And it's really hard to take him at face value, anything he says. And so for me as a fan, I think I've always just had a lot of disappointment. Maybe 10, 11 years ago on the channel, I wasn't properly articulating that, going off on these, profanity-laced rants on the guy. What it really comes down to at the end of the day is the fact that I, as a fan, am disappointed with Hogan's behavior in his life, and I feel like a career like his should be celebrated, and he's done a lot to taint and damage his own reputation, and a lot of that is due to his own greed, his own politics, and his own behavior. And I feel like Hogan could have a statue sitting on top of WWE headquarters. This guy could be immortalized as much as Andre is. And a lot of fans feel like he still is, but I think it could have even been more. I think WWE, as much as they acknowledge the importance of Hulkamania in pro wrestling, I think they would probably even acknowledge it more if Hogan had a reputation like Mick Foley. What if Hogan was just a nice guy like Mick Foley? I mean, my God, I would be sitting here singing his praises until the end of time. But unfortunately, Hulk Hogan is not Mick Foley. Hulk Hogan is a dick. So I just want to make my feelings clear there, because I don't want this to appear like we're celebrating too much the career of Hulk Hogan. This is because I have a YouTube channel that talks about wrestling. 40 years ago today, Hulkamania was born. How can I not come up here and talk about it? You know what I mean? So feel free to share me your comments, your thoughts, your opinions, and your memories of Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania. Where do you think he sits on the all-time list? I feel like, best wrestler all time. There's a lot of different metrics you can use. What are your arguments for or against Hogan as being the best of all time? If you do feel like he's the best of all time, tell me why below. If you don't, tell me why not. Just would like to read some of that. So yeah, 40 years of Hulkamania, that's crazy. I feel extremely old. I'm going to be 47 years old this year. And the fact that Hulk Hogan has been around for 4 decades is just really, really wild when you think about it, that it's been that long. My God, we're all getting old. I can't wait to see 80-year-old good mic work up here talking about Roman Reigns' career, all these years later. Who knows what we'll be talking about in the future, but 40 years is a long time, and that is a big, massive milestone there for Hulkamania. So thank you so much for watching. Appreciate you being here, and I will be catching you guys real soon. Take care. Peace.